Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. Chapter 1. The Gala. The Sanner Ballroom stood as a testament to old-world grandeur, its soaring ceilings adorned with frescoes that had witnessed countless tales of love and betrayal over the centuries. On this crisp autumn evening, the annual Renaissance Charity Gala transformed the space into a glittering sanctuary of wealth and influence, where Manhattan's elite gathered to see and be seen. Eleanor Whitestone's Louboutins whispered against the marble stairs as she ascended alone, each step deliberate and graceful. At 42, she had mastered the art of making an entrance without appearing to try. Her emerald silk gown, a custom Valentino creation, caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above, creating an ethereal aura that drew admiring glances from the guests already gathered in the grand hall. Time had been more than kind to Eleanor. It had been generous. The slight silver threading at her temples only enhanced her natural elegance, and the fine lines around her eyes spoke of a life rich with laughter rather than defeat. She had chosen to wear her chocolate-brown hair swept up, revealing a long neck adorned with a single strand of South Sea pearls, a gift she had bought herself the day her divorce was finalized. The sound of familiar laughter carried across the ballroom, stopping her heart for just a moment. She would know that sound anywhere. It had once been the soundtrack to her happiness. Marcus. Her hand instinctively tightened on the banister, the only outward sign of her inner turbulence. She hadn't expected him to attend this year, not after the scandal that had rippled through their social circle when their marriage imploded. Taking a steadying breath, Eleanor allowed her gaze to drift naturally toward the sound. There he stood, looking devastatingly handsome in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, his dark hair now distinguished with touches of gray at the temples. Marcus Langston, celebrated architect and her ex-husband of 6 months, was holding court near the champagne fountain. And there, wrapped around him like an expensive accessory, stood Lila Carver. The young woman wore a dress that might have been considered daring at the Met Gala, let alone a charity event attended by the city's old money. Its red fabric clung like a second skin, the color a sharp contrast to Eleanor's subtle elegance. Lila laughed too loudly at something Marcus had said, her hand possessively clutching his arm as though afraid he might slip away. Eleanor felt a familiar ache in her chest, but it was different now, more like the phantom pain of an amputated limb than the raw agony of fresh betrayal. She watched as Marcus's colleagues gathered around him, their smiles a touch too bright, their laughter a note too forced. They all knew, of course. In their world, secrets were currency, and this particular tale had been worth its weight in gold. The orchestra struck up a waltz, the opening notes of Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty, filling the vast space. Eleanor remembered dancing to this very piece with Marcus at their wedding, both of them drunk on champagne and possibilities. Now, she allowed herself a small, enigmatic smile. That Eleanor, the one who had believed in fairy tales and forever, seemed like a character from someone else's story. As she reached the top of the stairs, Eleanor caught her reflection in one of the gilded mirrors that lined the ballroom walls. The woman who gazed back at her radiated a quiet confidence that no designer dress could fake. She had emerged from the chrysalis of her marriage transformed, not broken. The butterfly effect of Marcus's betrayal had set in motion changes he could never have anticipated. Theodore Bennett, the gala's chairman, materialized at her side with 2 flutes of champagne. "Eleanor, you're a vision," he said, offering her one of the glasses. "The board was thrilled when you agreed to handle the interior design for the new children's wing of the hospital. Your vision for the project is exactly what we needed." She accepted the champagne with a gracious nod, noting how Marcus's head had turned sharply at the sound of her name. From the corner of her eye, she saw Lila's fingers dig deeper into his arm, like talons sinking into prey. The younger woman's insecurity was a tangible thing, floating across the room like expensive perfume. "You're too kind, Theodore," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying just far enough. "The children deserve a space that inspires hope and healing. Besides," she added with a subtle curve of her lips, "I finally have the freedom to pursue the projects that truly speak to my heart." The double meaning wasn't lost on anyone within earshot. Several heads turned toward Marcus, who had suddenly become very interested in his drink. Lila's smile had frozen in place, a perfect mask beginning to crack around the edges. The power dynamics in the room shifted, like tectonic plates, subtle but seismic. As Eleanor moved through the crowd, accepting kisses on cheeks and warm greetings from old friends, she felt Marcus's gaze following her. She remembered a time when his attention had been her sun, and she a flower constantly turning toward his light. Now, she was her own source of illumination, and the night was young. The annual Renaissance Charity Gala was about to become a masterclass in the art of elegant revenge, served at precisely room temperature. The stage was set, the players were in position, and Eleanor Whitestone had just made her entrance in the game of social chess that was about to unfold. She had already anticipated her ex-husband's every move. After all, she had learned from the best. 15 years of marriage to Marcus had taught her exactly how the mighty could fall, and fall he would, though not by her hand. Sometimes, the most exquisite revenge was simply standing back and watching karma do its work. Chapter 2. Shattered Reflections. The memory of discovery had a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient moments. As Eleanor watched Marcus and Lila from across the ballroom, time seemed to fold in on itself, transporting her back to that rain-soaked evening 6 months ago, the night her world had crumbled, with the precision of a controlled demolition. She had been sitting at her vanity, preparing for the Guggenheim benefit, when Marcus's phone had chimed with a message. It wasn't like her to look. Trust had been the cornerstone of their marriage. But something about his recent distant behavior had planted seeds of doubt in her mind. The message preview had appeared innocently enough on his unlocked phone. Missing you already. Last night was perfect. The perfume bottle she'd been holding had slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. The scent of Clive Christian Noway. 1. Marcus's gift for their 15th anniversary had filled the air, its once beloved fragrance now sickeningly sweet. The pieces of crystal had caught the light like diamonds, beautiful even in destruction. How fitting, she thought now, that something so precious could become dangerous when broken. Standing in the present moment at the gala, Eleanor took a measured sip of champagne, allowing the bubbles to dance on her tongue. She observed how Lila kept glancing around the room, as if searching for approval from the social circle she so desperately wanted to join. The younger woman's dress, a scarlet Versace that screamed new money, was a desperate attempt to belong in a world where subtlety was currency. The flashback continued to unfold in her mind, a parallel narrative to the present scene. That fateful night, she had waited for Marcus, seated in their library with his phone on the antique desk between them. When he'd walked in, loosening his tie with practiced ease, she had simply said, "Tell me about Lila." His reaction had told her everything. The slight stiffening of his shoulders, the almost imperceptible step backward. Marcus had always been excellent at negotiating deals worth millions, but he had never learned to lie to his wife convincingly. "She's nothing," he had started to say, but Eleanor had raised her hand, silencing him with the gesture she had perfected over years of chairing charity committees. "Don't insult me, intelligence, Marcus. That's beneath both of us." The conversation that followed had been surprisingly civilized, though each word had carved new scars into her heart. Lila had been his protégé at the firm for 2 years. The affair had begun during the Monaco project, late nights over blueprints evolving into something more. He spoke of connection, of feeling understood, of rediscovering passion. Each explanation was a fresh betrayal. Now, watching them at the gala, Eleanor noticed how Marcus's hand occasionally strayed to his collar, tugging at it as if it were too tight. It was his tell, a gesture she had come to recognize during difficult board meetings or uncomfortable social situations. Lila didn't notice it, of course. There were hundreds of such subtle signals that could only be learned through years of intimate knowledge, not stolen moments in high-end hotels. The weeks following her discovery had been a masterclass in dignity. Eleanor had moved through their divorce proceedings like a general orchestrating a strategic retreat. Their prenuptial agreement had been ironclad. She had insisted on it, ironically, to prove she wasn't after his money. But her real victory had been in the details, keeping their townhouse on the Upper East Side, maintaining relationships with their most influential social connections, and most importantly, preserving her reputation while rumors of his indiscretion spread through Manhattan's upper echelons. She had allowed herself to break down only once, the night after signing the divorce papers. Alone in their now her master bathroom, she had stared at her reflection for hours, watching tears track perfectly straight lines down her cheeks, ruining her carefully applied La Mer moisturizer. The woman in the mirror had seemed like a stranger, someone who had aged decades in mere months. But that night had also marked a turning point. As she'd wiped away the tears, she had noticed something different in her reflection. A steely determination that reminded her of her mother. Beatrice Whitestone had raised her to be resilient, to understand that true power lay not in the man you married, but in the woman you became. In the following months, Eleanor had reinvented herself with the same attention to detail she brought to her design projects. She expanded her interior design firm, taking on high-profile clients who had previously worked exclusively with Marcus's architectural firm. She redecorated the townhouse, erasing all traces of their shared life, with a palette of blues and silvers that made the space feel larger, cooler, more serene. The sound of Lila's too loud laughter pulled Eleanor back to the present moment. She watched as the younger woman touched Marcus's arm possessively, marking her territory. Poor girl, Eleanor thought, not unkindly. She had no idea that possession was an illusion, that Marcus was like water. The tighter you tried to hold him, the more surely he would slip through your fingers. Theodore Bennett appeared at her elbow again, this time accompanied by Victor Ramsey, whose recent acquisition of 3 major real estate developments had made headlines in the Financial Times. Victor's dark eyes held hers a moment longer than necessary as he bent to kiss her cheek in greeting. "Eleanor, you're absolutely radiant tonight," Victor said, his voice carrying just far enough to reach Marcus's ears. "Theodore tells me you're designing the new children's wing. I'd love to hear more about your vision for the project." She felt Marcus's attention shift toward their conversation, saw how his hand tightened around his champagne flute, the same possessive instinct that had once bound them together, now torturing him from afar. It was a satisfaction she hadn't anticipated. Not the pleasure of revenge, but the quiet vindication of having survived, thrived, and emerged stronger. "Of course," she replied to Victor, allowing her smile to reach her eyes. "Though I should warn you, once I start talking about design, it's hard to get me to stop." "I can't think of a better way to spend the evening," Victor responded, offering his arm as they moved toward the terrace. Eleanor caught their reflection in one of the ballroom's massive mirrors. They made a striking pair, her emerald gown complementing his classic black tuxedo, both of them carrying themselves with the easy confidence of people accustomed to moving through the world on their own terms. The woman in the reflection bore little resemblance to the one who had collapsed before her vanity mirror 6 months ago. This woman's smile held secrets rather than pain. Her posture spoke of strength rather than survival. The shattered pieces of her former life had been transformed into something new, something harder, something that caught the light, not like broken glass but like diamonds. Behind them, Marcus watched their retreat, his hand absently tugging at his collar once more. Lila was saying something, her red lips moving rapidly, but he wasn't listening. He was remembering another gala years ago, when Eleanor had worn white and promised to be his forever. How strange that forever could end so suddenly, leaving nothing but reflections of what might have been. Chapter 3. The Rising Star. The crystal glasses clinked like wind chimes as servers weaved through the crowd with practiced precision. Lila Carver watched them with the heightened awareness of someone who had spent years studying the choreography of high society from the outside. Every detail mattered, the way the servers held their trays at precisely the right angle, the subtle hierarchy in the vintage of wines being offered to different groups, the calculated placement of influential guests throughout the ballroom. 6 months ago, she had been the rising star at Marcus's architectural firm. Now, she was discovering that being his partner required a completely different kind of architecture. The careful construction of a social identity. From her position near the champagne fountain, she could observe Eleanor's masterful navigation of the room. The woman moved with a kind of confidence that couldn't be purchased or practiced. It came from generations of belonging. Lila unconsciously straightened her posture, trying to mirror that effortless elegance. Her Versace dress, which had seemed so perfect in the boutique, now felt like a costume in comparison to Eleanor's understated Valentino. Marcus's hand rested at the small of her back, but she could feel the tension in his touch. She didn't need to follow his gaze to know he was watching his ex-wife. That's what Eleanor would always be, the ex-wife, as if any other description would somehow diminish her significance. The thought made Lila's stomach twist with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. A flashback to her first day at Langston Architects 3 years ago invaded her mind. She had been 27, armed with a master's degree from Cornell and recommendations that had opened the right doors. Marcus had interviewed her personally, something unusual for an entry-level position. She remembered being struck by the way his office seemed to reflect his personality. Modern, clean lines, softened by classic elements, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city he had helped shape. "Your portfolio shows promise," he had said, studying her concepts for sustainable urban housing. "But potential isn't enough in this field. You need to understand the relationship between space and power, between design and desire." At the time, she had thought he was speaking purely about architecture. The memory shifted to their first late night working on the Monaco project. The office had been empty except for them, blueprints spread across his desk like a paper sea. She had suggested a bold modification to the building's facade, something that would challenge conventional wisdom while respecting the principality's historic aesthetic. Marcus had looked at her then, as if seeing her for the first time, not as a protégé but as an equal. "Your perspective is refreshing," he had said, standing close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that she would later learn was custom blended in Paris. "You remind me of someone." She had known he meant Eleanor. Everyone knew the story of how they met, the brilliant young interior designer who had challenged Marcus's vision for the Renaissance Hotel project, ultimately creating a collaboration that had launched both their careers and their romance. History had a way of repeating itself, but never quite in the way one expected. Now, standing in the Sanner ballroom, Lila watched as Victor Ramsay led Eleanor toward the terrace. The way he looked at her was impossible to miss. There was hunger there, but also something else: respect, admiration. Whatever it was, it made Marcus's fingers press harder against her back. "Darling," she said, trying to draw his attention back to her, "shouldn't we greet the Hendersons? They're potential clients for the Chicago project." Marcus's response was delayed by a fraction of a second, long enough for her to know his mind was elsewhere. "Of course," he said finally, turning to face her, "though I believe they've already signed with Ramsay Development for that particular venture." The news hit her like a physical blow. The Chicago project had been meant to be her debut as a full partner in the firm, her chance to prove herself to the board members who still viewed her promotion with skeptical eyes. She had spent weeks preparing the proposal, incorporating elements of sustainable design that would set their bid apart. "When did this happen?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The decision was made this morning," Marcus replied, his tone clipped. Apparently, Ramsay offered them a more comprehensive package. The implications hung in the air between them. Ramsay Development had been aggressively expanding its portfolio, and rumors suggested that Eleanor's interior design firm had become their exclusive partner for all new projects. It was a masterful move on both their parts. Ramsay got the sophistication and connections that came with Eleanor's brand, while she gained the backing of one of the largest development companies on the East Coast. Lila felt the familiar stirring of panic in her chest, the same sensation she had experienced during her first major presentation to the board. But back then, Marcus had been her champion, guiding her through the corporate labyrinth with the expertise of someone who had built the maze himself. Now, watching him watch Eleanor, she wondered if she had mistaken possession for partnership. A waiter approached with fresh champagne, and Lila noticed how he offered her the same vintage being served to the younger guests. While the bottle presented to Marcus was clearly superior, these small humiliations were beginning to accumulate, like grains of sand in an hourglass, marking the time until what? She pushed the thought away. "Marcus," she began, but was interrupted by the approach of Evelyn Henderson herself, a woman whose family had been shaping Manhattan's skyline since the Gilded Age. "Marcus, darling," Evelyn said, air-kissing his cheek while completely ignoring Lila's presence, "I trust you understand our decision regarding the Chicago property. Business is business, after all, though I must say Eleanor's vision for the interior spaces was quite compelling." Lila watched as Marcus manufactured a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Evelyn. Ramsay Development is lucky to have her expertise. Isn't it fascinating," Evelyn continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "how these things tend to work out? One door closes, another opens. Though I suppose in your case, you rather slammed that door yourself, didn't you? The older woman's gaze finally flickered to Lila, a dismissive glance that managed to communicate generations of social superiority in a single moment. Lila felt her cheeks burn, the flush clashing with her scarlet dress. She had earned her position. Her designs were innovative, her work ethic unquestionable. Yet here she stood, being dismissed as nothing more than the reason for a scandal. Across the room, Eleanor's laugh carried like music over the steady hum of conversation. She was standing with Victor on the terrace now, the city lights creating a backdrop that looked almost staged in its perfection. Several board members from Ramsey Development had joined them, their body language suggesting serious business discussion despite the social setting. Lila remembered finding a photograph while helping Marcus move out of the townhouse. Eleanor at their wedding, caught in a moment of unguarded joy. She had been wearing Vera Wang, her smile radiant, eyes fixed on Marcus with complete trust and adoration. Lila had studied that photo for a long time, trying to understand what made this woman so extraordinary that her shadow still lingered over everything, even in her absence. Now, watching Eleanor command the attention of Manhattan's elite with such effortless grace, Lila began to understand it wasn't just beauty or breeding or even talent. It was an absolute certainty in one's own worth. Eleanor had emerged from the ruins of her marriage not as a victim but as a force of nature. The orchestra began playing a waltz, Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. Marcus's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Later, Lila would learn that this had been his and Eleanor's song, the one they had danced to at every significant moment of their marriage. But for now, all she knew was that the man beside her seemed to be slipping away like sand through her fingers. "Shall we dance?" she asked, trying to reclaim his attention. Marcus shook his head slightly. "I need some air," he said, already stepping away from her. "Excuse me." Lila watched him disappear into the crowd, leaving her alone near the champagne fountain. She caught her reflection in its cascading surface. Distorted, fragmented, but still recognizable. The rising star, she thought bitterly, was beginning to look more like a falling one. A subtle movement caught her eye. Through the fountain's flowing crystal streams, she saw Eleanor watching her. There was no triumph in the older woman's expression, no satisfaction at witnessing this small humiliation. Instead, there was something that looked almost like recognition, as if Eleanor could see in Lila's face the same doubts she had once battled herself. The moment passed quickly as Victor drew Eleanor back into conversation, but it left Lila shaken. For the first time, she wondered if she hadn't stolen Marcus from Eleanor at all. Perhaps he had always been like one of his modernist buildings, impressive from a distance but ultimately cold and empty, designed to reflect glory rather than contain it. The evening stretched ahead of her like an elegant endurance test. She would smile and make conversation, play her part in this society drama. But standing alone in a crowd of Manhattan's finest, watching the man she thought she'd won slip further from her grasp, Lila Carver began to understand that some victories were really elaborate defeats in disguise. The clock struck 10, its chimes echoing through the ballroom like a reminder that all fairy tales have their midnight moment, when carriages turn back into pumpkins and borrowed glory fades. Lila straightened her spine and raised her chin, determined to maintain her composure. After all, wasn't that what she had learned from watching Eleanor all these months? Style wasn't about the dress you wore or the man on your arm. It was about facing your demolition with dignity and rebuilding yourself from the rubble. Let them watch, she thought, taking a deliberate sip of champagne. Let them whisper and judge. She would show them all that she was more than Marcus Langston's mistress turned partner. She was an architect in her own right, and if necessary, she would design herself a new future, one that didn't depend on borrowed prestige or reflected glory. But even as she formed this resolution, she could feel the weight of uncertainty settling around her shoulders like an invisible shawl. The night was still young, and in the glittering world of Manhattan's elite, fortunes could rise or fall in the space between one dance and the next. The real question was whether she would be standing or falling when the music finally stopped. Chapter 4. Whispers and Waves. The Sanner ballroom had transformed into a living organism, its occupants moving like schools of exotic fish through carefully delineated social currents. Eleanor navigated these waters with the expertise of a seasoned captain, while the wake of her passage created ripples that threatened to capsize those with less secure moorings. In this glittering sea, Victor Ramsay's hand remained at the small of her back as they moved from the terrace back into the main ballroom, the gesture protective without being possessive, a subtle but crucial distinction that hadn't escaped the notice of their observers. 3 decades in Manhattan's upper echelons had taught Eleanor that every action was noted, every interaction weighted, and measured against the complex algebra of social standing. "The Hendersons seem quite taken with your vision for the Chicago project," Victor murmured, his lips close to her ear. The intimacy of the gesture sent a fresh wave of whispers through the crowd. Though I suspect Evelyn was more interested in delivering that little barb to Marcus than discussing business. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. Evelyn never could resist a well-timed strike. She hasn't forgotten how Marcus backed out of renovating her Southampton estate last summer. The excuse he gave was creative differences, but everyone knew it was because he was too distracted by his personal situations. The memory of that time, when her marriage had been unraveling behind closed doors, no longer carried the sting it once had. Distance had transformed the pain into something more useful. Wisdom. She had learned that reputation, like fine crystal, could withstand a few chips without losing its value. But a single crack in the wrong place could render it worthless. Across the room, Marcus was engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Frederick Whitestone, head of the city's most prestigious architectural review board. Even from this distance, Eleanor could read the tension in his posture. Frederick had been one of their closest friends during the marriage, someone who had witnessed their story from its beginning. Now, his slightly raised eyebrows and tight smile suggested the conversation was less than comfortable. "Speaking of the Chicago project," Victor continued, skillfully maneuvering them toward a quiet corner near the orchestra, "I've been thinking about expanding the scope. The whole block has potential, not just the single building we initially discussed. With your vision for the interior spaces." He trailed off as Theodore Bennett approached, accompanied by Celeste Moreau, the French ambassador's wife, and one of Manhattan's most influential social arbiters. Celeste's approval could make or break reputations with the same ease that her husband negotiated international treaties. "Eleanor, ma chérie." Celeste purred, air-kissing both cheeks with practiced precision. "I've just been telling Theodore how absolutely transformative the children's wing designs are. Such vision, such humanity. Unlike some recent projects I've seen that seem more concerned with ego than elegance." Her pointed glance toward Marcus left little doubt about her reference. The orchestra transitioned into a slower piece, Debussy's Clair de Lune, its melancholic notes floating through the air like invisible threads connecting past to present. Eleanor remembered the first time she had heard this piece, in this very ballroom, 12 years ago. Marcus had just won the Pritzker Prize, and they had danced until midnight, drunk on success and possibility. Now, the music carried a different resonance, speaking of endings rather than beginnings. "You're too kind, Celeste," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying just the right note of modesty. "Though I must give credit to Victor and Ramsay Development for having the courage to support a more innovative approach." Theodore nodded approvingly. "The board was particularly impressed with how you've integrated healing gardens into every floor. It's exactly the kind of forward-thinking design we need." The conversation flowed seamlessly into a discussion of the project's technical details, but Eleanor remained acutely aware of the undercurrents sweeping through the room. Marcus had shifted positions, now standing near a massive arrangement of white orchids, his attention seemingly fixed on their group, while Lila spoke animatedly to a junior partner from his firm who looked increasingly uncomfortable. A server appeared with fresh champagne, Krug Grande Cuvée, Eleanor noted, the vintage reserved for the evening's most important guests. She accepted a glass with a gracious nod, remembering how she had once managed the intricate social hierarchies of such events as Marcus's wife. Now, she wielded influence in her own right, her power no longer derivative, but earned through talent and resilience. "The light installation in the main atrium," Victor was saying, his dark eyes intent on her face. "It reminds me of something I saw at the Fondation Louis Vuitton in Paris last spring. Were you inspired by their work?" Before Eleanor could respond, a subtle shift in the room's energy drew her attention. Lila was making her way toward them, her movements slightly too quick, her smile slightly too bright. The red dress that had seemed daring earlier now looked almost desperate, like a distress signal. "Mr. Ramsey," Lila said, her voice carrying a forced confidence that made several nearby conversations pause, "I hoped we might discuss the sustainable energy innovations we had proposed for the Chicago project. Some of those elements could still be integrated into your current plans." Victor's response was diplomatic but firm. "Ms. Carver, while your ideas have merit, we've already finalized the technical specifications with our current team. Perhaps another time." The dismissal was polite but absolute. Eleanor watched as color flooded Lila's cheeks, the younger woman's composure cracking like thin ice. For a moment, their eyes met, and Eleanor saw in Lila's gaze the same panic she had once felt herself, the terrifying realization that carefully laid plans were disintegrating. "Of course," Lila managed, her smile now brittle as spun sugar. "Another time." As she retreated, Eleanor noticed Marcus watching the exchange, his hand unconsciously moving to adjust his bow tie, a gesture she knew signaled deep discomfort. The symphony of whispers around them grew louder, like waves building before breaking. "Poor dear," Celeste murmured, her tone suggesting anything but sympathy. "It must be so difficult trying to maintain one's professional standing when personal choices have made certain circles less welcoming." Theodore cleared his throat diplomatically. "Speaking of professional standing, Eleanor, the hospital board is hosting a private dinner next week to discuss the next phase of development. We'd be honored if you'd attend as our special guest along with your escort, of course," Celeste added, glancing meaningfully at Victor. The invitation was more than a social courtesy. It was a public endorsement, a clear signal of where allegiances now lay. Eleanor could feel Marcus's attention like a physical weight, knew without looking that he would remember how such invitations had once been extended to them as a couple. "I would be delighted," she replied, allowing Victor's hand to settle once more at the small of her back. The orchestra began another piece, Strauss's Blue Danube, and couples moved toward the dance floor. Victor turned to her with a questioning look. But before he could speak, a commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. Nathan Sterling, chairman of the city's largest investment firm and a key client of Marcus's, was making an unexpected early departure. His wife's expression suggested a hasty retreat rather than a planned exit. More significantly, he had been scheduled to announce a major new development project later in the evening, one that would have cemented Marcus's firm's position as the city's premier architectural practice. Eleanor watched as Marcus quickly made his way toward the departing couple, but Nathan's curt handshake and avoiding gaze told its own story. Another piece of Marcus's carefully constructed empire was slipping away, not through any direct action of hers, but through the natural consequences of choices made months ago. "Shall we dance?" Victor asked, his voice drawing her back to the present moment. Eleanor placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. As they moved together with practiced ease, she caught their reflection in the ballroom's mirrors. A striking couple, power and elegance in perfect balance. The whispers followed their movement, but now they carried a different tone. Anticipation rather than scandal, appreciation rather than judgment. From this vantage point, she could see the entire room like a chessboard, each player making moves that would ripple through their shared world for months to come. Lila stood alone near a column, her earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. Marcus was still engaged with Nathan's retreating form, his shoulders set in a way that spoke of mounting frustration. The music swelled, and Victor drew her closer. "You're extraordinary," he murmured. His words meant for her alone, the way you've handled everything, the grace you've shown. Eleanor allowed herself to relax slightly in his embrace, aware that this too would be noted and discussed. But for the first time in months, she found she didn't mind being the subject of conversation. Let them talk. Let them see how a woman of substance handled both triumph and betrayal with equal elegance. The evening continued to unfold like an elaborately choreographed dance, each interaction precise, each consequence calculated. Eleanor moved through it all with the poise of someone who had learned that true power lay not in revenge but in rising above the very need for it. As midnight approached, the subtle shift in social tectonics was complete. Where once she had been half of Manhattan's most celebrated power couple, she now stood alone, yet stronger, more influential, more assured. The whispers and waves that had threatened to drown her 6 months ago now carried her forward, proving that sometimes the most sophisticated revenge was simply living well. The orchestra's final notes hung in the air like crystal drops, each one perfect and fleeting. Eleanor caught Marcus watching her one last time, his expression unreadable. But it didn't matter anymore. She had moved beyond the need for his approval or understanding. The woman who had once shaped herself to fit his world had emerged from the crucible of betrayal as something far more valuable, herself. As the evening drew to a close, the whispers continued their dance through the crowd, but Eleanor no longer needed to listen. She had written her own story in the language of success and dignity, and its eloquence spoke louder than any gossip ever could. The wave of change she had set in motion would continue long after the last guest had departed, reshaping the landscape of their shared world in ways that none of them, not even she, could fully predict. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, new opportunities. But for now, in the golden light of the Sanner ballroom, Eleanor Whitestone had proven that the best revenge wasn't just living well. It was living magnificently on one's own terms, without apology or regret. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. The inevitable collision of past and present crystallized near the champagne fountain, where streams of golden liquid cascaded like time itself, flowing, merging, impossible to grasp. Eleanor had been watching the delicate interplay of light through the crystal tears when she felt it, the shift in the air that always preceded Marcus's approach. 15 years of marriage had attuned her to his presence, like a tuning fork to its perfect pitch. Victor's hand, which had been resting lightly at her waist, tensed almost imperceptibly. He had developed a similar sensitivity over the evening, reading the subtle changes in her posture that telegraphed Marcus's proximity. But unlike Marcus, Victor's response was to draw closer rather than retreat, his protective instinct manifesting as quiet strength rather than possession. "I believe Mr. Langston would like a word," Victor murmured, his lips close to her ear. "Shall I give you a moment?" Eleanor turned slightly, allowing herself to study Marcus's approach reflected in the ballroom's mirrors. He moved with the same confident stride that had first caught her attention at the Renaissance Hotel opening 12 years ago, but now she could see the effort behind it. His shoulders carried tension that hadn't been there 6 months ago, and Lila's absence from his side spoke volumes. "Stay," Eleanor replied softly to Victor, her voice carrying just enough warmth to make Marcus's jaw tighten as he came within earshot. "Whatever needs to be said can be said in present company." The orchestra had begun playing Tchaikovsky's Waltz of the Flowers, an ironic choice given the thorny situation unfolding. Several nearby conversations paused as Manhattan's elite adjusted their positions to better observe the impending drama while maintaining plausible deniability of their interest. "Eleanor," Marcus said, his voice carrying that familiar timbre that had once made her heart race. Now it struck her as performative, like an actor's well-practiced line. "You look—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't give too much away. "Successful. Content. Unburdened," she supplied, her tone light but pointed. Amazing what divorce can do for one's complexion. A flash of something pain, anger, regret crossed Marcus's features before he managed to school them back into practiced neutrality. "I was going to say elegant, but I suppose those work too." Victor's hand remained steady at her waist, an anchor in the emotional currents swirling around them. The champagne fountain's gentle splash provided a soothing counterpoint to the mounting tension. "The Chicago project," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to ensure privacy despite their public setting. "Was that necessary? The Hendersons were already in final negotiations with us." Eleanor took a deliberate sip of her champagne, allowing the moment to stretch. "Business is business, darling. Isn't that what you always used to say? Usually right after explaining why you needed to work late with your protégé." The reference to Lila landed like a perfectly aimed dart. Marcus's hand moved to his collar, that telling gesture she knew so well. "This isn't about Lila," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed, her voice carrying the crystalline clarity of absolute certainty. "This is about consequences, about ripples spreading from choices made, about learning that actions, like designs, must have integrity to stand the test of time." She let her gaze drift past Marcus to where Lila stood, watching them, the younger woman's face a study in barely contained anxiety. The red Versace dress that had seemed so daring earlier now appeared like armor donned for a battle. Its wearer wasn't prepared to fight. The Sterling's early departure was unfortunate, Eleanor continued, each word precisely placed. I heard Nathan was supposed to announce the Murray Hill development tonight. 10 buildings, wasn't it? Would have been quite the feather in your firm's cap. Marcus's posture stiffened further. The Murray Hill project had been months in the making, a development that would have secured his firm's dominance in the city's architectural landscape. Its loss, coming on the heels of the Chicago decision, represented more than just a financial blow. You're enjoying this, he accused softly, something dark flickering in his eyes. Watching it all unravel. Victor shifted slightly beside her, a subtle reminder of his protective presence, but Eleanor needed no defense. She had spent 6 months rebuilding herself from the ground up, laying a foundation stronger than anything Marcus had ever designed. On the contrary, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I'm simply observing the natural order of things. You taught me that, remember? How form follows function. How every structural choice has its consequence. Though I suppose some lessons are harder to absorb than others. The champagne fountain burbled between them, its endless cycle of rising and falling waters a reminder of fortune's wheel. Around them, the ballroom continued its elaborate social dance, but the air in their immediate vicinity had become charged with unspoken histories and reproaches. We had 15 years, Marcus said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. 15 years of building something extraordinary. Did none of that matter? The question hung in the air like crystal suspended in sunlight. Beautiful, fragile, and potentially cutting. Eleanor felt Victor's subtle support, his silent strength allowing her to face this moment without flinching. It mattered, she replied, her voice gentle but firm. It mattered so much that when you betrayed it, the destruction was absolute. There's no partial collapse in architecture or love, Marcus. Once the foundation is compromised, everything else follows. Movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. Lila was approaching, her steps just a touch too quick, her smile just a fraction too bright. The younger woman had clearly decided that allowing this conversation to continue uninterrupted was too risky. Marcus, darling, Lila called, her voice carrying a note of forced cheer that made several nearby observers wince in second-hand embarrassment. The Warrens are asking about the Boston proposal. They need your input. The interruption was transparent in its desperation, but it served to break the moment's spell. Marcus's face settled into lines of resignation, the mask of successful architect sliding back into place. Of course, he replied, though his eyes remained fixed on Eleanor. We should. Yes, you should. Eleanor agreed smoothly. The Warrens can be quite demanding about their investments, though you might want to have alternatives ready. I heard they've been quite impressed with Ramsey Development's recent projects. The implied threat wasn't subtle, but then it didn't need to be. Marcus's expression tightened as he recognized the new reality. His former wife was no longer just a social equal, but a formidable business competitor. Eleanor, he started, but she raised her hand in that familiar gesture that had always silenced him. Don't, she said simply. Whatever you're about to say, whatever justification or explanation you've crafted, save it. We both know it won't change anything. Lila's hand found Marcus's arm, her fingers clutching with barely disguised anxiety. The contrast between the two women couldn't have been more stark. Eleanor's quiet confidence against Lila's nervous energy. Experience versus ambition. Substance outlasting style. It was lovely catching up, Eleanor concluded, her smile perfect and impenetrable. Do give my best to the Warrens. I'm sure whatever you propose will be adequate. The dismissal was elegant, but absolute. Marcus stood for a moment longer, words clearly battling behind his eyes, but in the end, he simply nodded. As he allowed Lila to lead him away, his shoulders carried the weight of recognition, not just of what he had lost, but of how completely the power dynamic had shifted. Victor waited until they were out of earshot before speaking. That was masterfully handled. Years of practice, Eleanor replied, turning slightly to face him. In architecture and marriage, the key is knowing which structures to preserve and which to demolish. The orchestra began a new piece, Ravel's La Valse, its gradually building intensity, matching the evening's emotional crescendo. Around them, the social atmosphere began to shift and settle, like dust after an earthquake. "Shall we give them something else to talk about?" Victor asked, offering his hand as the music swelled. Eleanor placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. As they moved together with practiced ease, she caught their reflection in the ballroom's countless mirrors. No longer half of Manhattan's most talked-about power couple, but something entirely new and perhaps more valuable, a woman who had learned that the best revenge wasn't in destruction but in creation, in building something stronger from the ruins of what was lost. The night continued to unfold around them, each moment adding another layer to the evening's complex social architecture. Eleanor moved through it all with the grace of someone who had discovered that true power lay not in the ability to hurt those who had hurt you, but in the strength to rise above the very desire for revenge. As midnight approached, she noticed Marcus watching them from across the room, his expression unreadable. Lila stood beside him, speaking animatedly to a group that seemed more interested in watching Eleanor and Victor dance. The younger woman's gestures had grown more pronounced as the evening wore on, her composure fraying like expensive fabric under too much strain. "Your ex-husband seems to be having an interesting evening," Victor observed, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Marcus always did hate watching things slip out of his control," Eleanor replied. "You'd think he'd be used to it by now." The champagne fountain continued its endless cycle, its waters catching and reflecting the ballroom's lights like countless tiny stars. In its surface, Eleanor caught fragmentary glimpses of the scene around them. Marcus's increasing isolation, Lila's desperate attempts to maintain their social position, the subtle but significant shifts in allegiance as Manhattan's elite adjusted to the new reality. She had not planned this evening as revenge, had not orchestrated Marcus's professional difficulties or social decline. She had simply focused on rebuilding her own life, on creating something beautiful and strong from the ashes of her marriage. That this process had naturally led to her ascendance while he struggled was simply proof that karma, like architecture, followed its own elegant rules of proportion and balance. The confrontation near the champagne fountain would be discussed in certain circles for weeks to come, analyzed for hidden meanings and subtle power plays. But for Eleanor, it represented something simpler and more profound, the final release of old patterns, the freedom to move forward without the weight of past hurts or the need for vindication. As Victor guided her through another turn, she caught sight of Marcus making his way toward the exit, Lila trailing in his wake. Their early departure would not go unnoticed, nor would the way Nathan Sterling deliberately turned his back as they passed. "Sometimes," Victor murmured, drawing her attention back to the present moment, "the most satisfying victories are the ones we don't actively pursue." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, new opportunities to create rather than destroy. The confrontation that had seemed so inevitable had turned out to be less about confronting Marcus and more about facing her own transformed reality. The orchestra's final notes hung in the air like promises waiting to be kept. Around them, the Sanner ballroom continued its elaborate social dance, but Eleanor no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. She had built something stronger than revenge, a life entirely her own, designed with the wisdom of experience and executed with the precision of someone who understood that the most elegant solutions were often the simplest. Let them whisper, let them watch, let them wonder. She had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that true power lay not in the ability to hurt those who had hurt you, but in the strength to build something so beautiful that the past became irrelevant. The night wasn't over, but its pivotal moment had passed. Whatever came next would be built on new foundations, with new blueprints, guided by the steady hand of someone who had learned that the best revenge wasn't just living well, it was living authentically, unapologetically, and with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who they were and what they were worth. Chapter 6. Beneath the Surface. The Sanner ballroom had become a theater of shifting alliances and crumbling certainties as the evening deepened, like one of Marcus's own architectural designs viewed through a fractured lens. Marcus Langston watched his carefully constructed world begin to show signs of structural weakness. The pristine surface of Manhattan's social elite had developed hairline cracks, spreading outward from the epicenter of his choices, like stress fractures in load-bearing walls. Standing before the ballroom's soaring windows, Marcus found himself caught between three reflections. The man he had been, the man he was, and the man he was becoming. The city beyond sparkled with its usual indifference, the lights of buildings he had designed piercing the darkness like accusations. Each one represented a triumph from his past, victories achieved with Eleanor by his side, her intuitive understanding of space and flow complementing his bold architectural visions. The champagne in his hand had lost its effervescence, much like his recent attempts to maintain the illusion of unaffected success. Behind him, he could hear Lila's voice, too bright, too insistent, as she attempted to salvage what remained of their professional connections. The sound grated against his nerves, like discordant notes in a symphony that had once been perfect. "Mr. Langston." The voice belonged to Edward Harrington, one of the city's most influential real estate developers and a longtime client. "A moment of your time?" Marcus turned, carefully arranging his features into an expression of professional interest, but Edward's face already told the story. This would be another diplomatic withdrawal, another contract silently slipping away. "The Singapore project," Edward began, his tone carrying that particular note of practiced regret that Marcus had become painfully familiar with lately. "We've decided to go in a different direction. Ramsey Development." Marcus finished for him, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. Edward had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Her understanding of how space affects human interaction is remarkable. The way she's integrated healing elements into the children's wing at St. Grace's Hospital. It's revolutionary. The board was quite impressed. The mention of the hospital project struck particularly deep. It should have been his commission. Would have been. If not for the scandal that had erupted around his personal life. Instead, Eleanor had secured it, transforming what could have been a simple medical facility into something that industry publications were already calling a new paradigm in healthcare design. "Of course," Marcus replied, his architectural training helping him maintain a facade of composure. "Eleanor has always had a unique vision." Across the room, he caught sight of her in one of the ornate mirrors. She was deep in conversation with a group of investors, her emerald gown catching the light as she gestured elegantly to emphasize a point. Victor Ramsey stood beside her, his protective presence a stark reminder of everything Marcus had cast aside. The orchestra began playing Debussy's Clair de Lune, and the memory hit him with physical force. Eleanor at their piano in the townhouse, playing this very piece while he worked on designs, the music and his creativity flowing together in perfect harmony. How many evenings had they spent that way, each supporting the other's passion, building something greater than themselves? "Marcus." Lila's voice cut through his reverie, sharp with barely contained panic. "The Bradfords are asking about the cost overruns on the Shanghai project. I tried to explain about the Sustainable Materials Initiative, but they're insisting on speaking with you directly." He looked at her, really looked at her, and felt a sudden wave of recognition. She was beautiful, yes, and talented in her own right. But standing here in the ruthless light of consequence, he could see what he had been blind to before. Her youth wasn't an asset, but a liability in a world where experience and subtle understanding meant everything. "Handle it," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made her step back slightly. "Isn't that what you wanted, to be taken seriously as a partner?" The words hung between them like shattered glass, reflecting uncomfortable truths from every angle. Lila's face crumpled slightly before she managed to recover, her professional mask slipping back into place with visible effort. "Of course," she said, but her voice had lost its confidence. "I'll just—" She retreated into the crowd, the red dress making her look like an open wound moving through the sea of more subtle evening wear. Marcus turned back to the window, but Edward Harrington had already moved on, gravitating naturally toward the growing circle around Eleanor and Victor. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. One by one, the pillars that had supported his professional dominance were crumbling not through any direct action of Eleanor's. No, she was too elegant for obvious revenge. Instead, she had simply continued being herself, allowing natural consequences to unfold, like a perfectly executed architectural plan. "The Warrens have signed with Ramsey Development." Philip Granger, his junior partner, appeared at his elbow with the latest blow. "They're announcing it tomorrow." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of another failure settle onto his shoulders. The Warren Project had been meant to be his statement piece, a declaration that recent events hadn't affected his standing in the architectural world. Instead, it had become another domino in the cascade of professional setbacks. "And the Boston development?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Gone as well," Philip confirmed, his voice carefully neutral. They cited a desire for fresh perspectives. Fresh perspectives. The euphemism almost made him laugh. What they really meant was that they wanted distance from the scandal, from the whispers, from the growing perception that Marcus Langston had lost more than just his marriage when he chose passion over partnership. The evening had taken on the quality of a slow-motion collapse, each interaction bringing new evidence of his diminishing influence. Even those who had once sought his mentorship now gave him a wide berth, as if professional failure might be contagious. Through it all, Eleanor continued to shine, her success not a weapon but a testament to her inherent grace and talent. She had emerged from their divorce not destroyed but distilled, her strength and vision refined by the fire of betrayal. The woman who had once been content to share his spotlight now commanded attention in her own right. The orchestra transitioned into another piece, Tchaikovsky's Waltz of the Flowers, and Marcus watched as Victor led Eleanor onto the dance floor. They moved together with the easy confidence of people secure in themselves and each other. The contrast with Lila's earlier nervous energy was stark and revealing. "She's something else, isn't she?" The voice belonged to Theodore Bennett, who had materialized beside him with the silent efficiency of someone used to observing human drama from close. "She always was," Marcus admitted, the words carrying the weight of belated recognition. "I just forgot. Or perhaps never fully appreciated it until now," Theodore suggested mildly. The question struck uncomfortably close to home. Had he appreciated Eleanor's quiet strength, her intuitive understanding of both spaces and people, or had he taken it for granted, like the foundation of a building, essential but unremarkable until it's compromised? "The Children's Wing Project," Theodore continued, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. "It's already being talked about in international circles. The way she's integrated healing gardens with patient spaces, the use of natural light and organic flow patterns, it's revolutionary." Each word was another crack in the facade of Marcus's professional reputation. The hospital project should have been his, would have been, if not for the scandal that had erupted around his personal choices. Instead, it had become Eleanor's triumph, a showcase for her unique vision and understanding of how space affected human experience. The board was particularly impressed with her presentation, Theodore added, twisting the knife with practiced skill, such attention to the human element, something that's been notably lacking in some recent submissions we've received. The critique was subtle but clear. Marcus's recent designs had been criticized for prioritizing dramatic statements over practical functionality, for seeking to impose his vision rather than serve the needs of those who would inhabit his spaces. He had dismissed such feedback as jealousy or lack of vision, but now, watching Eleanor expertly navigate both the social and professional aspects of the evening, he wondered if he had lost sight of something essential. Lila appeared again, her movements carrying the slight desperation of someone watching their dreams dissolve in real time. "Marcus, please," she said. "The Bradfords are threatening to go public with their concerns about the Shanghai project." The Shanghai project, another potential disaster in the making. The budget overruns had been significant, but he had been confident in his ability to justify them through the innovative use of sustainable materials. Now, watching his professional reputation crumble, he wondered if that confidence had been yet another form of self-deception. "Tell them I'll be there shortly," he said, his voice carrying a weariness he couldn't quite disguise. Lila hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but something in his expression made her retreat once again. The red dress that had seemed so alluring at the beginning of the evening now struck him as a symbolic representation of all his recent choices, bold but ultimately inappropriate, drawing attention for all the wrong reasons. The city lights beyond the window had grown colder, or perhaps the chill was coming from within, from the growing recognition of exactly what he had sacrificed in pursuit of what he now recognized as a mirage. The reflection looking back at him told its own story. A man at a crossroads, facing the consequences of choices made with too little thought for their structural integrity. In architecture, as in life, some damage couldn't be repaired. It could only be acknowledged, accepted, and used as a foundation for whatever came next. The orchestra began to play one final piece, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, its haunting notes a fitting soundtrack to the evening's denouement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new realities to face. But for now, Marcus Langston stood alone at his window, watching his reflection blur against the city lights, understanding finally that some losses, once sustained, became permanent features of the landscape of one's life. Behind him, the gala continued its elaborate dance of power and pretense, but he remained at his window, a silent observer to the shifting tides of fortune. The city beyond sparkled with endless possibility that now seemed to belong to others, while he stood in the gathering darkness, counting the cost of dreams destroyed by his own hand. In its reflection, he could see three distinct images overlaid: the man he had been with Eleanor, confident and complete; the man he had become with Lila, chasing an illusion of recaptured youth; and the man he was now, standing alone at the intersection of past choices and future consequences. The weight of recognition settled around his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He had destroyed something beautiful and rare in pursuit of what? Youth? Admiration? The illusion of recaptured passion? Now, watching Eleanor move through the room with such magnificent self-possession, he realized that he had never truly seen her until she was no longer his to see. The evening's subtle demolition of his professional and social standing continued, each interaction bringing new evidence of changed dynamics. Those who had once celebrated his vision now spoke of changing tastes and evolving perspectives in architecture. Those who had sought his mentorship now gave him wide berth, as if failure might be contagious. And through it all, Eleanor continued to rise, her success not a deliberate attack, but a natural consequence of her inherent grace and talent. She had emerged from their divorce not bitter or broken but renewed, like a building stripped to its bones and reconstructed with greater vision and purpose. The final notes of the orchestra hung in the air like crystal drops, each one perfect and fleeting. Marcus caught Eleanor's reflection one last time, watching as she accepted Victor's arm with natural elegance. They made their way toward the exit, surrounded by admirers and potential clients, leaving him alone with his reflection and the weight of irreversible choices. The city lights beyond the window continued to sparkle with indifferent beauty, each one a reminder of projects past and opportunities lost. In the end, he had built his personal life like some of his recent designs, prioritizing dramatic impact over structural integrity, choosing flash over foundation. And now, like those same designs, the flaws were becoming impossible to ignore. The night had become a masterclass in consequence, each moment bringing new understanding of what he had lost. Not just Eleanor, but the perfect partnership they had built, the way they had complemented and completed each other, both personally and professionally. He had traded substance for surface, wisdom for passion, and the cost was proving to be higher than he could have imagined. As the last guests began to depart, Marcus remained at his window, a solitary figure reflected against the backdrop of the city he had helped shape. The man looking back at him seemed older, wearier, but perhaps finally wiser. Some lessons, he was learning, came at a price that no amount of success could offset, and some mistakes, once made, became permanent features of the architecture of one's life. Chapter 7. The Dance. The orchestra's first notes of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake floated through the Sanner ballroom like memories given voice. Victor Ramsay's hand appeared before Eleanor with perfect timing, an invitation written in the elegant arch of his fingers. From across the room, Marcus watched as his ex-wife placed her hand in Victor's with the kind of grace that couldn't be learned. It had to be inherited, like the genetic memory of generations of society, women who had navigated these same waters before her. "Shall we?" Victor's voice carried just far enough to reach those nearby, pitched perfectly to suggest both intimacy and propriety. The simple question contained multitudes. An invitation to dance, yes, but also to something more, a future unburdened by betrayal, a partnership based on mutual respect rather than past wounds. Eleanor's smile held secrets as she rose from her seat, the emerald silk of her gown catching the light like captured starlight. "I thought you'd never ask." The dance floor cleared subtly as they moved to its center, other couples instinctively creating space for what was clearly the evening's defining moment. The orchestra seemed to understand the significance as well, each note of Tchaikovsky's masterpiece rendered with exquisite precision. From his position near the windows, Marcus felt the familiar ache of recognition. How many times had he and Eleanor danced to this very piece? It had been their song, chosen for its complexity and grace, for the way it seemed to mirror their own partnership, each movement building on the last, creating something greater than its parts. Lila's hand clutched his arm with increasing pressure. "Marcus, shouldn't we?" "Not now," he cut her off, unable to look away from the scene unfolding before them. There was something mesmerizing about watching Eleanor dance with another man, like witnessing an alternate version of his own life playing out in real time. Victor led with confident expertise, his hand at the small of Eleanor's back, providing just enough support while allowing her complete freedom of movement. They moved together as if they'd been dancing for years, each step precise, yet seemingly effortless. The contrast with Lila's nervous energy beside Marcus was stark and revealing. "They make quite the pair," Theodore Bennett observed, materializing at Marcus's other side with a fresh glass of scotch, rather like watching the future of Manhattan real estate take physical form, wouldn't you say? The comment struck with surgical precision. Victor Ramsey's development company had been steadily acquiring prime properties throughout the city, while Eleanor's interior design firm had become the most sought-after name in luxury spaces. Together, they represented a formidable combination of vision and execution, exactly what Marcus and Eleanor had once been. On the dance floor, Victor executed a perfect turn that sent Eleanor's gown swirling like emerald waves. The movement drew appreciative murmurs from the watching crowd. Even Evelyn Henderson, notorious for her critical eye, was nodding in approval. "Did you know," Theodore continued, his voice carrying that particular tone that suggested the information to follow would cut deep, "that Ramsey Development has just acquired the entire West Side waterfront project? Fascinating timing, considering your firm's original proposal for the space." Marcus's hand tightened around his champagne flute. The West Side project had been his dream for years, a chance to reshape Manhattan's skyline with a series of innovative mixed-use buildings that would redefine urban living. He had spent countless nights working on the designs, with Eleanor offering insights about flow and functionality that had made the concept truly exceptional. "Of course," Theodore added, twisting the knife with practiced skill, "they'll be taking a completely different approach. Something about integrating more green spaces, focusing on community interaction rather than architectural statements. Eleanor's influence, I imagine." On the dance floor, Victor drew Eleanor closer as the music swelled, their movements perfectly synchronized, each step and turn executed with the kind of confidence that came from absolute trust in one's partner. The watching crowd had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle of perfect partnership made manifest. Lila's fingers dug deeper into Marcus's arm. "We should dance too," she whispered urgently. "Show them that we're just as." "Just as what?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying an edge that made her flinch. "Just as elegant? Just as respected? Just as right for each other?" The words hung between them like shattered crystal, impossible to repair. Around them, the whispers had grown more pointed, more obvious. The contrast between the two couples, one ascending, one declining, was impossible to ignore. Victor guided Eleanor through another complex series of turns, each movement flowing naturally into the next. Her laughter carried across the room, genuine and uninhibited, the sound of someone completely at ease with themselves and their place in the world. Marcus remembered when that laugh had been for him, when they had moved through life with the same kind of seamless grace that Eleanor and Victor now displayed on the dance floor. "The Children's Wing project has already attracted international attention," Theodore continued, apparently determined to catalog every aspect of Marcus's professional decline. 3 other major hospitals have approached Ramsey Development about similar concepts. They're calling it a revolution in healthcare design. The music reached its crescendo, and Victor lifted Eleanor in a perfect embrace that seemed to stop time for a moment. Her emerald gown caught the light, creating a halo effect that made her appear almost ethereal. The watching crowd burst into spontaneous applause, led by Evelyn Henderson herself, the ultimate seal of social approval. "Magnificent," someone murmured nearby. "They're absolutely magnificent together." As Victor set Eleanor back on her feet, Their eyes met with the kind of understanding that Marcus remembered all too well, the silent communication of two people perfectly in tune with each other he had experienced. "Lila, I know." Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. "I've known since last night." Of course she had. In their world, news traveled fast, especially news of spectacular falls from grace. He took another sip of scotch, gathering courage. 2 years, he said, the number tasting bitter on his tongue. She was placed in the firm 2 years ago, specifically to identify vulnerabilities and exploit them, Eleanor completed for him. "Yes, I know that too." Marcus stared at her, realization dawning. "You knew before the board meeting?" "I discovered it last night," she confirmed. Her composure unwavering. At Le Bernardin, she was meeting with Nathan Sterling. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. "And you didn't warn me." A slight shake of her head. "No, I didn't." The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of rain against windows and unspoken understanding. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "For not warning you? For letting me learn the truth on my own terms?" He ran a hand through his wet hair, sending droplets scattering across the pristine upholstery. "For not trying to save me from my own choices?" She studied him thoughtfully, perhaps seeing for the first time the man who had emerged from the ruins of his own making. Some lessons have to be learned firsthand. "I've lost everything," he said, but there was no self-pity in his voice. "Only recognition. The firm, my reputation, my legacy." "No," Eleanor corrected gently. "You've lost what wasn't real to begin with. The firm was built on ego rather than substance. Your reputation was based on dramatic statements rather than genuine innovation. Your legacy," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your legacy is still yours to write." Outside, a flash of lightning illuminated the city, followed by a low rumble of thunder. Marcus watched the rain trace patterns down the windows, reminded of tears he had never allowed himself to shed. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words carrying the weight of years of recognition, not just for Lila, but for everything before that, for taking you for granted, for thinking passion was more important than partnership. For stop, Eleanor's voice was firm but not unkind. "You're not here for absolution, Marcus. You're here because you finally understand the price of the choices you made." She was right, of course. She had always been right about the things that mattered most. He looked around the room again, seeing not just the changes in decor but the transformation they represented. "You've built something beautiful," he said, meaning not just the redesigned space but the life she had created from the ashes of their marriage, something real. "Yes," she agreed simply, "because I understood that true beauty comes from authenticity, not artifice, something you used to know before you started designing for impact rather than purpose." The scotch in his glass caught the light, amber waves reflecting like the years they had shared. "Do you think," he began, then corrected himself. "No, I know it's too late for us, but do you think it's too late for me to remember who I was before all this?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering his question with the same thoughtful attention she brought to all her designs. "That depends," she said finally, "on whether you're ready to build from truth rather than illusion." Lightning flashed again, closer this time, illuminating them both in stark relief. Eleanor, elegant and composed in her chair. Marcus, still damp and disheveled on her perfectly appointed sofa. The contrast was almost poetic in its symbolism. "I don't know how," he admitted, the words costing him the last remnants of his pride. "Yes, you do." Her voice carried absolute certainty. "You've just forgotten. Remember the Renaissance Hotel, how we argued about the flow of space, about putting human experience before architectural statement? That was truth. That was real." The memory hit him with physical force. Their first collaboration, when her challenge to his design had led to something greater than either of them could have created alone, before ego and accolades had distorted his vision. Before he had started believing his own press. "The children's wing at St. Grace's," he said slowly. "Your design. It's revolutionary because it's honest, because it serves people, rather than imposing on them. Now you're remembering." Eleanor's smile held no triumph, only recognition of a truth finally acknowledged. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside, while the warmth of the scotch and the weight of understanding settled between them. Finally, Marcus stood, his clothes now merely damp rather than soaking. "Thank you," he said again, meaning it more deeply than before, "for showing me what real strength looks like, what real creation can be." Eleanor rose as well, walking him to the door. "Just remember," she said as he stepped back into the rain, "redemption isn't about reclaiming what was lost. It's about building something new from the lessons learned." The door closed softly behind him, and Marcus stood for a moment in the rain, looking up at the house that had once been his home. Through the windows, he could see the gentle glow of the life Eleanor had built without him. Beautiful, authentic, and complete. He turned and walked away, each step carrying him not toward what he had lost, but toward what he might still become. The rain continued to fall, washing away old illusions and making space for new foundations to be laid. Behind him, the townhouse stood as a testament to the price and possibility of redemption, not in grand gestures or dramatic statements, but in the quiet acceptance of truth and the courage to begin again. Chapter 12. Full Circle. 1 year later, the Sanner ballroom sparkled with the same crystalline elegance that had witnessed the beginning of this story, but tonight, everything was different. Eleanor stood once again on those marble stairs, but this time her hand rested comfortably in Victor's, her engagement ring catching the light like captured stars. The emerald silk of her gown had been replaced by a creation in midnight blue that seemed to hold entire constellations within its folds. The annual Renaissance charity gala had come full circle, but the woman ascending those stairs was not the same one who had faced her ex-husband's betrayal a year ago. She had been transformed, not by pain or revenge, but by the profound understanding that true strength lay not in surviving betrayal but in refusing to let it define you. "Ready?" Victor asked softly, his presence beside her as steady as ever. Through the ballroom's ornate doors, she could see Marcus sitting alone at a corner table. The past year had left its mark on him, his hair grayer, his face carrying new lines of humility. After losing his firm, he had done something unexpected. He had started over, taking on small restoration projects that focused on preserving historical buildings rather than creating dramatic new statements. It was honest work that served community rather than ego. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had found their true path. "I'm ready." The ballroom had been transformed by her design firm for tonight's event. Gone were the traditional crystal chandeliers, replaced by an innovative lighting installation that made the space feel both intimate and expansive. The theme was renewal, fitting for an evening that would mark not just her engagement celebration, but the official announcement of Ramsey Development's revolutionary approach to urban community spaces. Lila was conspicuously absent, having disappeared from Manhattan's social scene shortly after the truth of her manipulation had come to light. Last Eleanor had heard, she had surfaced in Chicago, working for a corporate restructuring firm, putting her talents for strategic demolition to more honest use. As they moved through the crowd, Eleanor felt the warmth of genuine congratulations rather than the sharp edges of society gossip. She had earned this respect, not through marriage or position, but through her own vision and integrity. "The West Side Project is extraordinary," Evelyn Henderson declared, approaching with genuine enthusiasm. "The way you've integrated community spaces with luxury elements, it's revolutionary. And the children's wing at St. Grace's has become a model for healthcare design worldwide." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, including Victor in her smile. "We believe architecture should serve life, not dominate it." From his corner, Marcus watched the scene unfold. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and he raised his glass in a gesture that held acknowledgement rather than bitterness. He had learned his lessons the hard way, but he had learned them well. The orchestra began to play, not Tchaikovsky this time, but a new piece commissioned specifically for tonight. Its notes speaking of renewal and possibility, rather than tradition and constraint. "May I have this dance?" Victor asked, though they both knew the question was merely a formality. They had been dancing in perfect harmony since the moment they met, their partnership based on mutual respect and shared vision rather than passion's fleeting fire. As they moved across the dance floor, Eleanor caught glimpses of their story reflected in the ballroom's mirrors. the woman who had faced betrayal with grace, the man who had seen her strength rather than her wounds, the path they had built together towards something greater than revenge. The evening flowed around them like light, through perfectly designed spaces, each moment carrying its own significance. The announcement of their engagement was met with genuine joy. The presentation of the West Side Project's final phase drew excited murmurs of appreciation, but it was the quiet moments between these events that held the deepest meaning. The shared glances, the gentle touches, the unspoken understanding that they had built something rare and true. As midnight approached, Eleanor found herself back on those marble stairs, looking out over the gathered crowd. She saw Marcus preparing to leave, his solitary figure carrying both regret and redemption. She saw her own team of designers and architects, passionate young talents who shared her vision of creating spaces that enhanced lives rather than egos. She saw Victor waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs, his love for her as solid as the foundations they built together. And in that moment, she understood the final lesson of her journey, that the greatest revenge against betrayal was not in destroying what was lost, but in creating something so beautiful that the past became irrelevant. She had not merely survived betrayal, she had transcended it, using its lessons to build a life more authentic and meaningful than any she could have imagined before. The night air carried the promise of spring as they stepped out onto the terrace, the city spread before them like a canvas waiting to be transformed by their shared vision. "Look," Victor said softly, pointing to where the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the sky. A new day. Eleanor leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "A new beginning," she agreed. Behind them, the gala continued its elegant dance, but they stood together in the growing light. Understanding that true love was not about grand gestures or passionate declarations, but about building something lasting, something real, something that made the world better by its very existence. The city began to wake around them, its buildings catching the first rays of sun like promises waiting to be kept. And in that moment of perfect clarity, Eleanor knew that she had not just survived her story, she had transformed it into a testament to the power of authentic living, of choosing creation over destruction, of building beauty from the ashes of betrayal. For in the end, the greatest victory was not in making others suffer for their wrongs, but in refusing to let their wrongs define your future. The sweetest revenge was not in destruction, but in creation, not in hatred, but in growth, not in bitterness, but in the quiet joy of building something true and lasting and beautiful. As the sun rose over Manhattan, painting the city in hues of possibility, Eleanor and Victor stood together on the terrace, their love a testimony to the power of building rather than breaking, of creating rather than destroying, of choosing light over darkness. And in their story lay a lesson for all who had faced betrayal, that the true measure of strength lies not in how well you survive the storm, but in what you build once it passes,